Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another bonus episode. These episodes I drop midweek because during our normal weekly Bible study, where we're going through the book of Mark, my sister and co-host Kaylee asked really good questions that I don't have a full and complete answer on. And so I try to create these in the interim to help answer those questions. So this week we are in what's coming up, Mark chapter 7. And we're talking about verse 19. I'll go back to 18 just for a bit of the context. But he's talking to the Pharisees about the things that make you clean and unclean. Are you also lacking in understanding? Don't you realize that nothing going into a person from the outside can defile him? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and is eliminated. Thus he declared all foods clean. And so we were having that conversation about clean foods and unclean foods. And so this is what that question sounded like in that video.
Last question on this section.
Cool.
So obviously in like the law, we've talked about, you couldn't eat pigs. There's a whole list of what you could or couldn't eat. But then here, Jesus is now saying like any food is clean. Like what's kind of the purpose behind that? Like why would God give the Israelites these rules on what they like don't eat these things and then Jesus come to say, okay, now they're fine.
Sweet. So what I want to do is address two things. One, I want to look at that exact verse in verse 19 there in Mark, talk a little bit about some of the disputed versions that people would talk about when looking at that verse. Very brief conversation. And then we'll actually look at answering Kaylee's question, which is what is the purpose of those food? Sorry, the printer just went off. What was the purpose of those food laws in the Old Testament if Jesus comes in the New Testament and just says, don't need them? Like, why would you have those in the first place? And I'll talk about a few options, some that I heard growing up and some that I found while researching that I think don't really answer the question. I think parts of them may contribute, but I don't think it's the right full answer. And then I'll give you guys the can't really say the answer, but what I believe is the answer. Also, other people agree with me. Back that up with some verses, and hopefully this will clear up that question. And I love getting these questions. I love doing these bonus episodes. In fact, I thought these would be in my normal videos, which are kind of set like a Bible study. I don't want to interrupt that flow of conversation, but these are a bit more casual. So if you would like to sponsor one of these bonus videos, we're always looking for people to support and give. There'll be a link down in the description for supporting our ministry. Okay, so let's first talk about Mark 7, verse 19, and some of the differing opinions on it. So this part at the end, so if you look at various translations, and a great place to go to if you want to review multiple translations and then have commentary on what it probably means, I tend to go to Bible Ref. And so they'll list out some of the different translations and how they handle a certain passage. Most verses, there's really nothing to it, but there's a few that stand out because translating languages can be difficult. And this is one of those passages that is difficult. And the big part comes in where most of our modern translations has, thus he declared all foods clean. And if you look at the King James Version and even a little bit of the New King James, but I think the New King James is similar enough that I felt like that's fine. But if you look at the original King James, that's not very apparent. Thus he declared all foods clean. They kind of go with a different statement there, which I found really interesting. I said, wow, that's kind of cool. And then I had to investigate why that is. And that led me down a rabbit hole because I don't know Greek. So I had to go to, I think it's called Hermeneutic Stack Exchange, which I don't normally go to because that's like the nerds talking. And I'm not at that level. Like, I'm pretty nerdy, but like they are like scholarly nerdy. But I went there and they had this whole discussion thread, multiple discussion threads about this, and very expert people. Here's the Greek. Greek has different rules in it than English. So some of the things I don't even know the names of, but there's possessiveness to verbs and there's gender with words and all these things that go into how you translate. So let me just flush out the what the endpoint was. Is all of the people on there said um, the way that the modern translations put it, the thus he declared all foods clean, is a completely perfect and fine translation. It's definitely not word for word, but we don't typically do a word for word anyways, because that doesn't make sense. But the way that they're assigning the verbs to the whatever, they said that's a very good translation. And the King James just operating off a different mindset, probably not following the Greek so much. So that seemed to be the consensus. So that made me feel better. So if you ever hear an argument that this verse doesn't apply, you can just kind of say, well, experts do agree that it's fine. Plus, let's say that this verse, all the experts said, no, it's wrong. You still have a lot of Paul in the New Testament. You still have Peter's vision that's described in Acts. You still have all these other New Testament examples where the food laws and all a bunch of other laws in general that oh, most of the laws are we are not under the law anymore. So just because if even if you do fall on the I don't think that verse is right, you still have all those to contend with. So food laws no longer a thing. So that out of the way. It was a very interesting deep dive. I'll link to at least some of what I referenced down below. Um, but you can also do your own investigations if you'd like. So, what were the top three other reasons that I found for why the food laws existed in the Old Testament but weren't needed in the New? The first one, and this is one that I grew up with. I think there's some component of this, but I do not think this explains it fully. I'll tell you why. And that would be health. The animals that God deemed clean for the Israelites to eat versus the animals that he deemed unclean, you could see a health benefit for avoiding certain types of meat or certain types of animals. Common examples would be bats were on the forbidden list and bats carry diseases. Vultures were on the forbidden list. Any bird of prey was on that list. Um, they were forbidden and they carry lots of diseases. Um, and then certain types of non, not fin, scaled fish, so crabs and things like that, oysters, etc. And then I'm probably going to get it wrong, but it's types of animals who don't have the split hooves and something about the cud. And so people will point, so a pig would be example, and people would say, well, then you can get sick from pigs. So there's these examples of health benefits, and they're saying that God ordained it to be that way to protect the Israelites from these diseases they wouldn't even known about. Um, and that's what's given. I think part of that could be true, but if that was the explanation, why would then in the New Testament Jesus be like, and I don't care about your health anymore? So I don't think that one holds the right weight for the explanation for why it was there and why it's now no longer there. Doesn't mean that God did protect them from some health things through those times, but I think there's got to be a bigger reason than just the health. So that's what I grew up with hearing about. And I think it's an okay one to believe. I don't think it fully answers it. The second one that I found while doing some research was the clean animals that they were allowed to eat are the correct version that animals should be. So I think this is more evident if you look at, say, the birds. Birds are supposed to be fruit and seed eating animals. And so the ones that have turned into predatory animals, those are unclean. They're not following that original design. And you would say that the fall of man, that curse of sin has infected those species that over time they went out of their nature. And so those we will not eat because they have gone away from their nature. So same with sea creatures. Sea creatures are supposed to have scales because it has some sort of cleansing to it. Um, but the other sea creatures that don't have that are unclean because that's not what they were supposed to be like. Land animals would be similar. I find that argument a bit harder to make about the way animals were supposed to be, but the argument's there that there's a correct way the animals were supposed to be in each of their environments. Some are not following that. You are only to eat the ones within that. Um, so I guess that kind of creates a distinction between the animals, but doesn't fully answer why then the switch of, oh, well, now it doesn't matter that they're not following their nature, right? It still doesn't answer that question. So even if that is an underlying component, I don't find that one very useful. So not my favorite answer there, but that is a thought that's out there. The third one, and I don't really find a lot of weight with this one at all, but I did run across one person that treated the Old Testament laws as if, well, it was all a metaphor or an analogy or um, some sort of way to teach the Israelites an underlying message. And so if you look at each of the different species, they represent something different. And if you look at the attributes that they were supposed to have, those mean something, and you're supposed to apply that to our lives. So even as a New Testament Christian, you can look at those, decipher the code of what those mean, and apply it to your life. Those sorts of things, I think it preaches fine, and I think you could give a sermon like that, and there's not wrong points, but that doesn't explain why it's in the Bible, why God told them to do that, and why it has changed. But like if you still wanted to teach the lesson, you would keep the food laws. And one person could come up with these metaphors, this person come up with these metaphors. Who's right? I don't know. So that was my least convinced argument that I did see out there. Um, but I just wanted to share that with you guys. And if I can refine the video I found, I like the guy. He had a good connections to stuff, but that just doesn't answer the question that we're looking at. So those were my top three that I found that kind of had some weight in some of them. But here is the best explanation that I found out there. And I'll go back and try to find those resources and link them down for where you could get it. But I think Got Questions was probably my like, yep, they said this, and I totally agree. The purpose of those food laws were to keep Israel set apart from other nations. I got a few verses that I want us to read. Let's jump to Exodus 19:16. This would be the first time that this is brought up. 19:16. I didn't even have it on the right page. Well, that's why I have the wrong verse. Was it 19:6? Must be 19:6. Yep. We're going to read 19 verse 5 and 6, just so we have the complete sentence. Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites. So you get that in Exodus. You get something very similar, but it is expanded on in Deuteronomy 7, verses starting around verse 6. Similar phrasing, but then it goes on and does more. The important part in that verse in Exodus is the kingdom of priest idea. God didn't pick Israel, and this is in the Deuteronomy, not because they were anything special. Like they weren't the most numerous or the most well-behaved people. He picked them because he made a promise to their ancestor Abraham, who was according to the Bible, a good person, but not perfect by any means. He plucked him out of randomness as well. But he made that covenant and he's sticking with these people. And these people were set apart from the other nations, not to be better or to be God's only people. You saw that in the Exodus. No, the whole earth is mine, but you are being chosen to be a holy people, a priesthood. Even though they have their own priesthood, they are a priesthood for the rest of the world. And so all these food laws, plus all the laws in general, were there to keep Israel from being exactly the same, but also more importantly, from mingling with all these other nations. Because as soon as you are mingled in and blended, and you're not an identifiable difference than other cultures or people, how then can you be the priesthood for those other people? And so these food laws, which I think are actually foundational, because if you've ever lived in community with others, think about church, especially if you're looking at small town church or very traditional church, meals and food. When you're dating, you meet over food. It's a very intimate, and it communicates a shared cultural acceptance and similarity, to be able to sit down and eat with others. And so if they're eating like others, they will then eat with others. And then that leads on that train to we're no longer set apart. But if, hey, we can't even eat the stuff you're eating, sorry, I'm not going to come over for dinner. Like, I see what you're making, can't have that. That's a very good barrier for we are set apart as a nation to be God's priesthood for the world. Now, does that mean Israelite did their best job at that? No, there are highlights, but um, that was the intentionality behind it. So now we move into the New Testament. I want to go to Galatians 3:24. This doesn't talk specifically about the food laws, but we can make it connect. This is Galatians 3:24. I'll go back to 23. Before this faith came, we were confined under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith was revealed. The law then was our guardian until Christ, so that we could be justified by faith. But since that faith has come, we are no longer under the guardian. For through faith you are all sons of God in Christ Jesus. So Paul is more talking about, hey, we don't need to sit, we don't all are Gentile Christians. We don't have to conform to the Jewish way of living because the Jews can't even follow that correctly. The whole point of it was to set apart and to show like we can't do it. We need Jesus. It's more what he's talking about. But that idea of, okay, now Christianity is not just for those Jews, but for the Gentiles. We no longer need that separation. Israel is no longer the priesthood in this new covenant relationship. Everybody in the world is part of this covenant, and Jesus acts as the priest, the high priest, the one that Israel couldn't be. So we no longer need the food laws to separate us from the other nations. We actually want to engage with and be with other nations. You actually see this. Paul describes in one of his letters how Peter was with him in his church, and Peter was there having a meal with all the Gentiles, and Paul was really happy about that. But then when some Jews came in, Peter didn't want to look like he was eating with the Gentiles, and so he left, and Paul confronted him about it. So it's there in the New Testament, like, no, don't let these food laws separate us from each other like they were supposed to separate in the Old Covenant. And I think that is the best explanation for why there are food laws in the old and why they got abolished, along with a lot of other laws, but the food law specifically. And I hope that answers Kaylee's question. It certainly answered mine. And that study was very rewarding, and I got a lot out of it. I hope you guys did too. Thank you guys. These one-off videos do generate more views and bring in other people randomly. So if you found this channel and you want to go through this Mark study with us, please join. I have other studies as well. Depending on when you watch this, I could have many other series on YouTube as well, or podcasts. So thank you guys. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.